Hey YouTube, Alex here, and in today's video I thought I'd discuss some of the advantages of dating in the Philippines. I'm here in my friend's garden enjoying a nice, comfortable morning here in Colorado. And why don't we go ahead and get into these reasons. I think that the first and most obvious convenience that I'm going to mention when it comes to dating in the Philippines is that you can basically speak English with them. So for those who aren't familiar, English is the second language in the Philippines, and so most Filipinos speak at least some English, especially Filipinos that have worked in the like BPO industry, business process outsourcing, also the tourism industry. These types of people definitely will have English that has been honed by practice. So for those who are coming from, like, say, the United States or other Western English-speaking countries, then that's really a non-issue. There's going to be much less language barrier. Doesn't mean they're going to know everything about your life in America and vice versa, but it's a pretty good starting point. That being said, if you are, especially if you're an American, then it's not unlikely or unheard of for the Filipina, assuming you're an American man looking to date a female Filipino, woman, then basically a lot of them have familiarity with things like NBA, perhaps less so with NFL, but definitely basketball is really big over there, and in particular professional basketball from America. So these kinds of little things that you might not expect to be able to connect with a person from another country on, actually, you could definitely connect with them on that. There's also other things like the fact that the U.S. has had a military base there for many years, and that certainly results in some dissemination of American culture. The next thing I'm going to mention here is that the Filipino culture is fairly laid back. So especially for me, coming from a Japanese background, then I'm used to an extremely kind of strict environment, a little bit harsh perhaps. And if you're coming from a similar background, then you might find that the sort of laid back personality of many Filipino people in general is something that you like. We talk about expat life, and I think that part of that is dating, but also part of that is the the types of people that you're going to interact with on a day-to-day basis. And so the vast majority of Filipinos I've met have been just really kind, easy to get along with people. And I'm not going to say that's always the case. I certainly don't want to attach, certain ideals to a large group of people, but there is certainly the experience of many people, I think, that you can talk to that say similar things about their experiences in the Philippines. And it's really just worth considering what, not just what your life is going to be like with your potential partner, but also, the life that you're going to have within the community that you choose to live in as an expat. So the next factor I'm going to talk about here is going to be the next factor I'm going to talk about here is the idea that you might want to sort of get to know their family. Let's say you meet a Filipina, you're really liking her, you date her for a while, you're spending time there in the Philippines. Of course, this is presuming reopening. For those of us coming from Western countries, maybe we're not super close to our families. I know some people are, but at least in my case, I'm not close at all to my family. Several of my close family members have passed away. So as far as family connections here in the U.S., that's just not a factor for me. I do have very good friends I'm very close with, but I think most people understand there's a boundary between friendship and family. And you have to be really, especially for me, I have to be really cautious of being aware of that boundary and understanding that boundary, because I've certainly been taken advantage of by people who felt that I cared more about a given friendship than I did, or than they did. And so that's something that you have to be considerate about. But let's say you do meet a really wonderful Filipina, presuming you're a guy, she's a gal, and you choose to date her. there is some likelihood that she's got a decently sized family. Maybe not a massive family, but in many cases she will have extended family that if you're looking to kind of be around people that have some similar qualities as her and some things in common, then there is that opportunity to have extended community. Now, you do have to be cautious of getting taken advantage of, and I'll probably get into that in another video, but that's a sort of a different topic. If we're just simply talking about the positives or potential positives, I'd say having that extended community that's not really, frankly, existent in most urban developed areas for a lot of people. I know some people are the exception, but many people, I think, do struggle with isolation, and that's something that there are places where, in my personal feeling, there are opportunities to feel less isolated. Another factor I'll mention here is that if you are somebody that, let's say you're dating in the US and you're used to people having to work all the time, and you don't want to date a partner that works all the time, understand that, at least in my case, even some of the professional Filipinas that I've met, they work 40 hours a week. And they're not working these 60-hour weeks. They're not traveling as much for work. They have more flexibility when it comes to making plans, in my experience. A lot of the American women I've dated have been college students and working, or one or the other, but just really extremely busy and not having a lot of free time to hang out, spend time together. So if you're somebody that you want to spend a bit more time with your partner and you want to have that opportunity to count on being able to spend time with them on the weekends, these things I think are a little bit more doable in the Philippines than the United States anyway. It seems like if you're looking to go out on dates, you want to go to the movies, you want to go to different kinds of markets, shopping malls, maybe even travel as a pair, then these kinds of things just seem more doable, not just from a time perspective, but also a cost perspective. If you're looking at doing these things in the US, they can cost hundreds and hundreds of dollars, but flights, accommodation, and food, transportation are all much cheaper in many cases in the Philippines, especially presuming you're not going to buy there. So definitely something to think about, not just the factor of them having a more flexibility in their schedule, but also things being more affordable to do. The next point I'm going to get into here, and this touches a bit on age gap relationships, which I don't want to get into too much detail about, but certainly it's the case that if you're, say, a guy that you're, getting older and perhaps you've been divorced or you've had some long-term relationships that didn't work out. Like in my case, I haven't been divorced, but I have had some long-term relationships that didn't work out. It often feels like after a certain age, then you're really limited in your choices, if you have any choices at all. It seems like, in my case anyway, after I finished college, most of the people I knew were married, and some even had children. And this became even more the case by the time especially in the last couple of years as I'm approaching 30. And so for me, when I consider my options for dating in the US, whether it be in my hometown or other areas, I'm often not satisfied. It's often just, very few people left, and the people that are single, many of them have issues. And I know I have my own issues. This isn't something to pick on American people about. I know it's not easy to make a life here, but I have to be honest. And so when I consider this factor that, I'm not exactly thrilled about some of my options, then I have to consider, well, are there other places that I could go? And it's certainly the case that in the Philippines anyway, it's not really stigmatized for a guy like me that's 28 to date a chick that's 25. And I'm not saying that's stigmatized here, but it just seems like the women that are 25 in the US are pretty well established, whereas a lot of the women I met in the Philippines that were 25, many of them still lived at home with their parents. Not all, but many of them, because they were single, it's considered very traditional in Asian countries that until you get married, you stay at home, you live with your parents, you help out with the bills, you learn more things from them. You have just a lot of benefits from that kind of thing. It's heavily stigmatized in the West, like, oh, you live in your mom's basement way of thinking. Doesn't make any sense to me. But anyway, that's beside the point. So if you're somebody that, especially guys, that you do feel like, wow, I just don't really have a whole lot of options here, a whole lot of opportunities, then you may consider the Philippines. You may find that being, say, 3 or 4, maybe 5 or 6 years older than your partner, presuming she's a consenting adult of legal age, that it's not really a big deal. It's not really something that you have to think about. It's not something that you have this experience where you feel like, we're just trying to, figure something out. You can really kind of, I think, go back to pursuing genuine relationships as opposed to perhaps looking at yourself like, what's wrong with me? How am I still single? Which I do feel some people do feel that way as they approach 30 and beyond, whether they're men or women. Like there is this kind of societal encouragement to pursue relationships. Hey, Barney. The next thing I'm going to mention here is, if you're somebody that you're from a city or metropolitan area, and you have the preference to also date somebody from a city or metropolitan area, and you're having trouble with that in the US, like perhaps you're in New York City or you're in Chicago, then going to the Philippines, you can date in places like Manila and Cebu. So I think there's sometimes this misperception that a lot of guys that date in the Philippines, they go out to the middle of nowhere and try to meet women that are perhaps limited in life experience. They've mostly lived in the province, and they've mostly interacted with a few people that, they've known their whole lives, family members, neighbors, things like that. But if you go to places like Cebu and you go to places like Manila, a lot of these women are familiar with different aspects of life in a city. They have tried different kinds of food. They've heard of different places. Perhaps they've thought about traveling to different places. Some may have even traveled. The reason why I say some is it can be quite strict for women to travel out of the Philippines due to different kinds of crime-related things. You can do more research on that. I'm not going to get into that in this video, but all of that being said, alongside that, I mentioned you may be from a city, but you also may be from a small town, and you may be one of those people in a small town that has a lot of travel experience. Maybe your parents were in the military, or maybe you had some kind of traveling sales job or something, but you find yourself in that small town and talking about a lot of these things that you'd like to do. And if somebody hasn't made that jump from a small town to a big city, then it's possible it's going to be harder for you to relate. I know in the case of one of the Filipinas I dated, she had moved from a more sparsely populated part of the sort of greater Cebu area. Not even really the greater Cebu area, like I think she was from Bohol, but she moved to Cebu for work, and so she definitely could relate as far as that's concerned, as in terms of life in a bigger city, kind of the things that come along with that. So if you're somebody that you're used to being able to have a lot of different city amenities, and you're trying to meet halfway with a potential partner that isn't used to that, isn't used to the faster pace, isn't used to perhaps the diversity, isn't used to the opportunities, then that may be a point of conflict that isn't as much of an issue with somebody who is also experienced in that way. So anyway, I hope this video has been helpful. This video I kind of want to discuss some of the good aspects of dating in the Philippines. Of course, I'll probably make a downsides video as well. If this video has been helpful, definitely give me a thumbs up. Let me know what you think down in the comments. Have you dated a Filipina? What was that like? What was your experience like? Do you plan to visit the Philippines at some point? Have you been before? All these things are really interesting discussion points. Definitely want to continue the dialogue, and definitely subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll talk to you soon.